Hey everyone, thanks for tuning back in. Welcome back to one of our summer rapid fire journal club series on ARDS. I'm back today with Luke Hedrick. Hey Luke, how's it going?
Hey, Dave. Good. Happy to be back.
Yeah, what's better than during the summer, you're on the beach, you're going into the ocean thinking about ARDS. Nothing better than that.
Exactly. Nothing like a light beach read talking about respiratory failure.
Yeah, of course. That's exactly what. So we've covered the ARMA trial in our first episode, a landmark trial telling us about low tidal volume ventilation. Luke, what study are we going to talk about today?
Yeah. So today we're going to continue the less is more theme. We're going to get into the FACTT trial that was published in the New England Journal in 2006.
Fantastic. I'm excited to talk about FACT. I think it's actually one that is talked about a little bit less and maybe a little bit misunderstood in the broader ARDS literature. So I'm pumped to dive into it. So, Luke, tell us about the background leading up to this trial and why we wanted to study fluid balance in ARDS.
Yeah. So pulmonary edema is a hallmark of ARDS, and it worsens with increased hydrostatic pressures. However, mortality in ARDS is usually from non pulmonary organ failure. And so that led to pretty varied approaches to fluid management, prioritizing either decreasing pulmonary edema or intravascular volume, but at the risk of theoretically decreasing cardiac output, or approaches that kind of turn that on its head and prioritize the opposite.
Yeah, fantastic. I think this piggybacks well on something you mentioned in the first episode, which is that most ARDS patients don't die of hypoxemia, but certainly their lung protection is one of our main priorities. And prior to this, we didn't really know what was the best balance. Are you trying to use fluids to optimize cardiac function, maybe renal function at the sacrifice of your pulmonary health? Are you trying to do things in the vice versa? How much should you prioritize them? Honestly, this is still an ongoing question in ARDS and sepsis, and we should do a rapid fire journal club series on basically just fluid management in the ICU eventually. So still questions to answer, but I think this trial was well placed to try to tell us some of the answers to these questions. So what did the trial look like? How did they design it? And who were the patients that we ended up studying?
Yeah, so this was a randomized controlled 2 by 2 factorial design trial at 20 North American medical centers that ran from the summer of 2000 to the fall of 2005. Their primary outcome was 60-day mortality, but they also looked at vent and ICU free days, organ failure free days, as well as the rates of dialysis. In terms of participants, they included intubated patients with ARDS and the presence of or the intention to place some kind of central venous catheter. In terms of their exclusion criteria, there were a handful. Anyone who had a pulmonary artery catheter already, because that was one of the potential interventions in that 2 by 2 factorial design. Someone whose ARDS had been going on for more than 48 hours, someone who was already on dialysis, folks with chronic lung, liver, or neuromuscular disease, or who had a recent acute MI, anybody who had DAH from a vasculitis, lung or bone marrow transplant in your past, or any kind of irreversible condition causing hospice eligibility. And interestingly, shock was not an exclusion criteria. About a third of the patients in the study were in shock on enrollment. Generally speaking, they were trying to exclude patients whose comorbidities would independently influence mortality, vent weaning, or compromise compliance to the protocol.
Yeah, Luke, it stated and going through, and I think you pointed out the interesting non-exclusion of shock, which I think is a great decision just because so many of our ARDS patients are in shock. And so if you had this really curated randomized controlled trial where you had no shock with ARDS, I don't know how applicable it would be to all the patients that we're seeing. Certainly would be applicable to some, but less broad. You also mentioned the PA catheter, one that's part of the protocol that we'll talk about, but two, that it would be an exclusion if they already had it. This is from a time when PA catheters were just way more common in the management of sepsis and in the medical ICU. We just see this less frequently now.
Yeah, and on that point, they actually excluded 91% of the screened patients, mostly because they already had a PA catheter. The MD refused or they had some kind of comorbidity. But one of the most common reasons someone got excluded is because they already had a swan.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. It really reflects the treatment practice then. And talking about that, when you exclude 91% of the patients that you screen, you do have to think about if you're biasing your patient population. But I will say that this patient population that you're left with is probably very early in the initial ARDS presentation and before they were able to have a PA catheter placed.
And so then just to summarize who they were left with was middle-aged intubated patients with early moderate ARDS without many comorbidities. And the mean P to F was in the 150s in both groups at randomization.
Fantastic. So still a real moderate ARDS group, maybe a little bit less sick than the last group we looked at from ARMA, where the mean was in the 130s. You imagine you have more people who are less than 100 in that one. Definitely still a sick group without many comorbidities where we can really naturally answer this question. So now down to the meat of it, the part that I think is always the most exciting and important and relevant to our practice is they wanted to look at a liberal versus conservative fluid strategy. So what are those things, right? That's where the meat and potatoes are. So can you walk us through the interventions in both the control arm and the intervention arm?
Yeah, so the intervention here is pretty complicated. Taking a step back, the N was just over 1,000. There were 1,001 patients that were randomized in a 2-by-2 factorial manner to either one, receive a PA catheter or a central line, and then two, 7 days of a conservative or a liberal fluid management strategy. Everyone in the study got lung protective ventilation. For the PA catheter arm, that could be swapped out for a central line after the third day if there was no other protocol directed intervention based on the SWAN. And then in everyone, that central access could be removed 12 hours after extubation. And the actual fluid management strategies are complicated. If you're interested, there's this really dense graphic of what they actually did, but suffice to say, it had very specific guidance based on if the patient was first hypotensive or requiring pressors rather, and then two, if not, whether they had adequate urine output and were warm or cold. And then ultimately, the protocol was the same other than what they were targeting. So in the conservative group, they were aiming for a CVP of less than 4 or a wedge pressure of under 14. And then in the liberal group, aiming for a CVP of 10 to 14 or a wedge pressure of 14 to 18.
Thanks for walking us through that, Luke. Yeah, it is a very complicated protocol. I think a very thoughtful one. We'll post that picture that you're talking about along with this episode. And if you're watching this episode, we'll put it up on the side of the screen so you can see how things broke down. As you mentioned, at the end of the day, they're having really CVP and wedge targets. I'll say CVP and or wedge target. I'll say this is interesting. It's a little bit different than what we would even do now as well. We really don't use CVP for total body fluid balance in the ICU, knowing that it has less correlation with total body fluid in our critically ill septic and ARDS patient. But I think it still provides certainly a metric to go by that's going to lead to either more fluid resuscitation or less. And I think the interesting thing to look about in this protocol is what was the intervention that they were doing? Is the intervention limiting fluids, giving fluids if they're hypotensive, or actually giving Lasix? And so there are some, to dive forward, some criticisms of the trial in that even the conservative arm wasn't getting a ton of Lasix to get them total body negative. A lot of times they were ending up in the even or less positive range. And so looking at the protocol, the groups that end up getting Lasix seem to be groups that are getting a little bit more of the conservative management. And we can kind of discuss this more when we get into the results. But as you said, suffice to say, we're going for filling pressures, and that filling pressures we'll see in a second if it really translated into people getting less or more fluids. So on that note, Luke, how did the two randomized interventions pan out? What was the fluid balance of these patients once they got into the protocol?
Yeah, so they achieved a pretty good spread between the groups. When you look at the fluid balance between all comers, the liberal group was net positive just under 7 liters at the end of a week. And then the conservative group was actually just net negative, like 130 cc's. When you look at subgroups, so specifically folks who were in shock or folks who were not in shock, that spread persists, shifted in one direction or the other. So what I mean by that is the shock patients in the liberal group were net positive even more, 10 liters at the end of the week, whereas the conservative group was still positive, but just under 3 liters, so still a 7-liter spread. The folks who were not in shock were shifted that other direction. So the liberal group was net positive, just over 5.25 liters, whereas the conservative group, I should say, was net negative 1.5 liters at the end of the week. And then when they measured those filling pressures using those catheters, they reflect these differences.
Certainly, their intervention had the attendant effect of less fluids and a lot less fluids. We're talking about 7 to 8 liters in these patients. So we should have a good setup to help answer our question. Just to build on what I was saying previously about the protocol, I think that the protocol clearly had this large spread. And so we can take a lot away from what the trial ended up finding. Some will say that, again, overall, you didn't end up extremely negative in the conservative group. So there's still this question of if you were really trying to diurese people aggressively up front. But when we know that a lot of patients are getting 7 liters of fluids and the rest are ending up slight negative, that should be a good comparison. And then something you had pointed out to me, Luke, is that like when they compare the fluid balance of the liberal group to other trials in the ARDS-NET family, they find that they were pretty similar. And really, we should note that liberal group was the standard of care or aggressive fluid resuscitation. And the intervention here of withholding fluids and getting people to stay even or slight negative really is a significant change in practice that we're going to examine.
Yeah, that was an important point, I think, for me in particular, reading this, just because those end of a week liberal fluid balance numbers were pretty eye opening. We don't see that a lot anymore. Folks who within 1 week of ICU time are net positive 10 liters. That's not the most common outcome anymore.
100%. And a lot of this reflects the SWAN-based directed care in associated conditions as well, sepsis, which is also often overlapping with ARDS. Okay, so we have a good inclusion, exclusion. We have a good intervention that achieved what it wanted to. Let's get to the bottom line. Luke, what did they end up finding?
Yeah, so in terms of 60-day mortality, there was no statistical difference between the two arms. There was a 2.9% point estimate in favor of the conservative arm, so 25.5% versus 28.4% 60-day mortality, which does raise the specter of underpowering. So when they did their power calculation, they estimated a 10% difference in mortality with their intervention. But as the trial stands now, no statistical difference in 60-day mortality. Vent-free days and ICU-free days both favored the conservative arm. So vent-free days at 28 days was about 2.5 days higher in the conservative arm. And then you see that reflected in ICU-free days as well, about 2 days higher. In terms of shock, there was no difference, which is reassuring when you think about the safety of potentially giving some folks lower fluid. If the concern at the time was that you would lower cardiac output, seeing no difference at all in the shock rates was reassuring. And then interestingly, when they looked at rates of dialysis at 60 days, the conservative arm had a 4% less point estimate for the rates of dialysis. It was 10% versus 14%. That p-value is 0.06, so it's right technically on the edge of what we would call statistically significant, but I think is a relatively provocative number there.
Definitely. And it certainly, in the trend that it's going, makes us feel also reassured that our strategy is not being harmful. Yeah, the interesting part of this trial is that, as you pointed out, it's technically a negative trial. On their primary outcome, they didn't show a difference in mortality. They had estimated as 10% or had a power for a 10% difference. As you point out, that may have been a large difference going into it. Looking at the secondary outcomes, we see no difference in mortality. We see that a bunch of them are shifting in the worst direction with getting the extra fluids. So ends up making you wonder, okay, if you're giving all of this extra fluid, you actually have the same mortality or even slight trend towards the benefit in the intervention group or the conservative group. And you're getting these sort of negative outcomes of longer time on the ventilator and longer ICU stay. What are you really achieving with all of that?
When I try to put that into a neat take home message for me, I would say that this trial showed that a conservative fluid management strategy in ARDS shortens ventilator dependence and ICU length of stay without worsening shock or end organ function. And so, put another way, dry lungs are happy lungs.
Yeah, 100%. That's what we take from this. And how we end up applying it. I'm sure everyone who's listening has heard that phrase in the ICU. And now you can say, dry lungs, happy lungs. Luke said, back trial. I can back this up. All right. Thank you all for listening. This is a second episode in our ARDS summer series. We have a few more coming for you, reviewing the landmark literature in ARDS. And so we hope you'll join us for those. Luke, have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Looking forward to these.